slight correction to that wonderful introduction. It wasn't National Geographic. I've published books for the Smithsonian, but you've heard of the Smithsonian as well, right? Yeah. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be asked to come here today. Don's right, he didn't ask me, but I think he's going to ask me back depending on how things go today. It was Ken Marsh, who I've known for a long, long time, associated with railroads. You know, Ken wrote a book on the Clinchfield, and he's been a strong supporter of the Railroad Museum almost from our first day. And when he called me and asked me to do this, he said, the Kiwanians are really important to me. This is a real important group for you to come talk to, and I appreciate you doing that. And by the way, I won't be there. But you know Ken, he's busy. I want to introduce you to the George L. Carter Railroad Museum. We're in our 14th year. I hope that you've had the opportunity to come and visit us. We're only open 5 hours, 1 day a week. We're open on Saturdays from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, and there's no admission charge. We are part of East Tennessee State University, and George L. Carter played a very important role in that university, and that if it were not for George L. Carter, the university wouldn't be there. He wooed the groups coming from Nashville that were going to make, beginning in 1909, one new university or one new school. Actually, they were teachers' colleges called normal schools, one in each of the 3 grand divisions of the state. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of competition in Tennessee and across the state, but particularly in East Tennessee, to try to be the town that was chosen by the governor's committee to be that site. And he got them to come back to Johnson City for a second look in 1909, and he had a crew straight a road to the top of a hill that he owned on his property of 120 acres, so he could drive the group up there the next day and they could look out over the land that he was about to donate. And he donated 100 acres, his farm on the west side of fledgling Johnson City, and gave them $100,000, and created a streetcar line that would come on down to serve both the VA facility at Mountain Home as well as the new university. So the normal school was started, and 29 students showed up for that very first class. We've come a long way. We're now the Buccaneers. We were the Normalites for a lot of years, and I'm not sure how cheerleaders really get into cheers for Normalites, but that's where we were. But we've got several groups affiliated. The Mountain Empire Model Railroaders have been around for about 28 or 29 years, and they are the major docents of volunteers for the museum. Their model railroad layout now has a permanent home, whereas before, as a modular layout, they would meet maybe once or twice a year if they could find the space big enough, and they would put their 4- and 8-foot modules together and run their trains. Well, they can run them anytime that they want. Now we've got Historical Railroad Society, the George L. Carter Society as part of it. These are folks that are interested in the prototype trains, not the models. And the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad Historical Society is also affiliated with the museum. So we're getting support from lots of folks. That's kind of a blank looking slide. Here's another one. Whoop. This shows part of our layout. We have 2 big galleries, and I'll walk you through them in just a moment. But for the last 10 years, we've been working on the Tweetsie Railroad side. We've got a 1,300 square foot gallery, and this is one of our little trains coming across the Blevins Bridge on the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina that started in Johnson City and went to Cranberry, North Carolina. We are all volunteers. The slide on the left-hand side of your screen shows the front door of our building. We're in what was originally the the student center on campus with its rec rooms, its bowling alley, its ballrooms and others. And we now occupy about 5,000 square feet there. And it's all volunteers. The Model Railroad Club that the Mountain Empire Model Railroaders used to have 25 to 30 members, but now that we're in a permanent location, it's 130 plus every year. So we've got a lot of support. We have a children's playroom. We had a room that was too small to really put model railroads in, and I kept watching kids come in and wanting to get their hands on $500 model railroad locomotives going around, and this has been a very successful room for us. Pre-COVID, again, 1 day a week for 5 hours, we're getting over 2,000 children and their parents and guardians coming into our playroom. So it's a place where they can build their own railroad empires and make a lot of new friends. Usually when we hear them cry, it's because somebody said it's time to go. And then we remind them the magic word is ice cream, and that's up to the parents. We have a growing railroad library, primarily through donations. Ken Marsh, for example, has donated most of his railroad library to us. We have over 2,400 cataloged hardback books that are each different from the other, and we're about to have a sale. We've got about 400 duplicates that we're now organized, and we need to clear the shelves. So we're basically out of room in our library, but this may be the largest railroad library in the state. We have hundreds of DVDs along with that, not just for the hardbounds. A lot of them are first editions, many of them are autographed, many of them are very rare copies. We also have static displays. We have a number of large display cases around the room that showcase prototype things like railroad china, for example, are modeling sorts of things as well. So there's a great variety of things we're able to showcase. We also have a donors wall so that we pay tribute to those folks who are either donating in-kind gifts or those that may be just donating some money for us to use. The museum is part of East Tennessee State University, but it has an exceedingly small budget, mostly to pay for the space itself. And so most of what we have existed on are donations from the outside, and folks have been really generous in doing that. This is the Mountain Empire Model Railroaders layout. This was the original gallery, 2,400 square feet, including a small workroom to one side. This is a gallery that most people see when they come in. And the Model Railroad Club, this layout is HO scale. Some of you are familiar with Lionel. You probably had Lionel trains as a kid going around the Christmas tree. HO means half of O, or half of Lionel. So if we scale this out, 1 foot in HO scale is equal to 87 real feet. So it's a rather small, compact way to put a lot of railroad in a very small place. This is their layout, and it's 44 feet by 24 feet roughly. It features Southern Appalachia summertime, so it has a season theme as well as a general location theme, but it doesn't try to duplicate any particular part of Appalachia, but a little barn like this lets you know that this is somewhere nearby, right? We've seen Rock City barns all our lives. There's a lot of detail that goes into this. This particular barn is not a kit. It's what we call scratch built. So various kinds of materials are put together, and in someone's eye, they could see a barn, and they created the barn out of what they saw. A lot of the trees that you see on the layouts, we make ourselves. And that becomes really important, especially when you're doing mountain scenes, as we're doing over on the Tweetsie side, this little railroad with a heart that ran right through the Appalachian Mountains. If you're starting making trees and you're buying those trees ready-made, 6 trees will cost you about $40. If we make them ourselves, we make better trees than we can buy, and it doesn't cost nearly as much, and it's a great learning process. So much of what you're going to see, this is the longest bridge on the MEMRR layout. This is a 7-foot bridge, and we get some spectacular views for camera bugs that you can get down and take a a long look at something from a very different angle, and there's a lot of photographic history. And people coming into the museum that have railroads in their past start seeing the trains go round and round, and they begin to tell us stories about an aunt or an uncle or a father or a grandfather that worked on the railroad or that was influenced by the railroad. And we have captured these stories. We've interviewed a lot of these folks. We produced a book several years ago called Tales of the Rails. It's over 300 pages, and it's broken into Clinchfield and Southern and Norfolk Southern and Tweetsie Railroad with their stories, the kinds of stories that you don't find in most railroad books that are talking about how many tons were hauled and how much it cost and what the destinations were and what the speeds were. This is another layout on a smaller scale. This is called N scale, and the scale is 1 foot equals 167 feet. So it's about twice as small as the other scale that we were just talking about, the HO scale. This was a donated layout to the university from a gentleman in Knoxville, and if you look kind of closely, you may recognize some of the buildings. He did a lot of downtown Knoxville on this particular layout. It's 11 feet by 22 feet. And here's yet another scale. This is called G scale, where the locomotives and the rolling stock and all the figures are much larger. It's 1 foot equals 35 feet. And this scale is often used in people's backyards. People create what are called garden railroads. They take their trains outside because this is too big to have very much track and rolling stock and structures inside the house. And a lot of these are set up so that they're pretty much weatherproof or weather resistant. And a lot of landscaping goes into the backyard for the trains. This is a late 1800s logging town scene, and you can see lots of lumber in the foreground. This is how you start a big project. This is our Tweetsie room, again 1,300 square feet. And we start out with what's called bench work. So you get a design of where you want the train to go, what's the best way to try to lay out the room for traffic flow and where people can see most of what you want them to see fairly up close, but still have them move through the rooms. So this is L girder bench work as it's just beginning to go in to rooms that President Paul Stanton gave us. We doubled the size of the space. He'd given us one small room, and we started there. And as we began to talk to him, he decided that he was going to let us have a bigger room that was being used by another group. And the folks who had this room, when the word began to get out, began to wonder what was going to happen to their space. And so they called me in for a meeting, and we talked for a little while, and we talked about them giving up the space and the museum getting the space and what the pros and cons were. And I said, you really don't need to be worrying about this one extra little room that we're getting, because I'd really asked for the whole building. I didn't hear much pushback after that. So you get a plan. This is the open bench work that you're looking at. So you dream it, you plan it, and then you build it. And we've been building on this one section for about 10 years. That's not every day and every moment of the day, but when we can get in and actually begin to work on it. So here's a layout. And you see it's a series of peninsulas so that people can come in and out. The spacing is about 5 feet apart. And we're going to run from Johnson City, which would be in the lower left-hand corner, all the way to Cranberry, which is over on the right. And this was the destination of the railroad. It started in the late 1860s, and they went bust. And it was revived again in the late 1870s by a group from Pennsylvania that had already built a narrow gauge railroad up there to haul coal. It's called East Broadtop Railway. Well, Ariel Pardee and his business partners came down because they were buying the Cranberry Mines over in Cranberry, North Carolina. And the Cranberry Mines had the richest magnetic ore vein, some of it several feet thick, known in the country at the time. It had been known since the 1820s. Problem was getting it out of the mountains. And they decided that a narrow gauge railroad was the way to go. Up into the Civil War, the standard gauges for railroads in North America were 5 feet. The standard gauge now is 4 feet 8.5 inches. That's from top of one railhead to the other. But a 5-foot railway, which is what they started with the original Tweetsie line, made it from Johnson City to Hampton, again, before they ran out of money. But there was no way it could negotiate the mountains to get into any further than they had gone. But a narrow gauge, a 3-foot gauge, with smaller locomotives and smaller cars, works just fine on the narrow passages that the mountains provided for it. So here's our layout. Here's bench work filling this room. Johnson City is going to be in the far end where you see the blue cases, and Cranberry is here in the foreground. And the work begins. So now you're beginning to see some flat shelf-like boards circling around on the top. That's where the railroad's going to be. And it starts in Johnson City on the flats, and by the time we get past Hampton, we start climbing grades. This railroad eventually, when it went all the way to Boone, at one point, at Linville Pass, was the highest railroad in North America, over 4,000 feet above sea level. Ours is not that steep, but once we start the climbs, we go up 1/8 of an inch every foot. So it really is going up toward Cranberry. You do a lot of things when you get started. This is a Johnson City engine house mocked up as a cardboard to see if it's going to fit. We try to do it to scale. That engine house is 180 feet long, so it's going to take up a bit of space, over 2 feet of space, as we scale it out. And we begin laying out track. We begin to weave together what's called a basket weave that you don't see here. These blue partitions are going to be the view blocks from one side to the other, because again, we're going around a peninsula. So on one side, the scenery is going to be different from what it is on the other side. But this shows you the basket weaves that we do. You use hot glue gun, you take strips of cardboard, you make the basic shapes. You overlay that with plaster cloth, the same kind of plaster cloth that when we were growing up, if you broke your arm or you broke your leg, that's what they were wrapping around you and letting it set up. It becomes a great lightweight shell for the scenery that you're going to put on it. So everything is hollow on the inside, and you see the shells going up. So plaster cloth strips going on. It begins to look more and more like this as we get it covered. You can see the track. There's a little ribbon running around now on those shelves that we were creating. And trees in the distance are called puffball trees. They're about the size of a ping pong ball, that's slightly larger. You just mold a round ball of material and you spray it with glue, and then you rub it into ground foam of different green colors, and you get this round ball. And if you put it on a mountainside in the distance, as you see the one in the background, it begins to look like a forest. It's nothing but a series of round balls, but you vary the size, you vary the color. As you're coming towards you, you make them slightly larger, so you've got some concept of scale and depth. And then you put in the foreground trees that are individual little trees that have great shape and design and texture, and it makes your eye believe that every tree that you're seeing must be just like that. This is Cranberry, North Carolina in the background, the mountain slopes that you're beginning to see. So the destination for our railroad, background scenes painted. And this is some of the detail. All the bridges and all the tunnels, 5 tunnels on the line, are to scale. They're the exact scale feet that the tunnel would have been in length. The bridges are exact copies of the last bridges that they had in those locations. In 1901, there was a huge flood and washed out most of their wooden bridges and a lot of the track. And a lot of work had to go back in to reestablish bridges. They bought a lot of used railroad bridges from up north that were standard gauge, and that's what they replaced their bridges with. And a lot of those metal bridges, or all those metal bridges, are still standing today. So the bottom left-hand picture is a photograph of the actual bridge, and that's my model of the actual bridge that you're seeing up above that on our layout. So they are duplicates of each other. With 3D printing, we can actually through the builder's plate that went on that bridge, and that's what you see in the inset. If you go across the Blevins Bridge, and some of you have been there, the old builder's plate from Pittsburgh is still there with the date of 1889, and that's on our little model bridge as well. So on the Tweetsie side, unlike the other layouts, we are trying to recreate in miniature something that really was, a historical layout. So we're walking the lines, we are photographing the rock structures, we're photographing the tunnels, and finding as many buildings as we can, mostly in photographs, to recreate them. And that's about what I'm going to be showing you on this line. So how do you make a tunnel? Tunnel number 5 was called the sand tunnel because the formation was unstable. It kept eroding in. They had to keep removing rocks from the sand tunnel. So we start here, again with our basket weave in the top left-hand corner, and then we began to apply the plaster cloth and shape it the way it's supposed to be. And then the rock work that goes around it, and you see the completed sand tunnel here, and here is another view of the train going toward the sand tunnel. A little bit of the Doe River is in the bottom left-hand corner. And then the other view over on the right is coming toward that tunnel from the west, and you can see our rendition of the Doe River down below. So it looks pretty good, doesn't it? Kind of looks like a real railroad. Well, that's what we're trying to do. The clouds have been photoshopped in on this particular one, so we don't have clouds yet in the building. And you can see kind of the effects of the erosion that took place. So here's another view looking down at it, and you can see all the eroded slopes, and the rock formations there are different than they are any place else along the line. There are these big columns of rock. And so again, we've tried to be true to the prototype and create the same kinds of things that you would have seen along the railroad. This is the Doe River Gorge in its beginning. Doe River Gorge has some neat landmarks. It's got one concrete retaining wall that was put in after the 1901 flood. It's got another longer one that's made out of stone that was put in for the same reason, to protect the railroad itself, because a lot of the railroad had washed in at these points. It also has some geological features. There's a series of rocks that curl to the left called Curly Rock. And there's another one that overhangs the railroad itself called Hanging Rock. Well, we've tried to recreate that. So here's our mountain view. The Doe River would be off the bottom right-hand corner, but here's a train coming up through, and Hanging Rock is here in the foreground. On this narrow little shelf, they had to lower workers down with black powder to blast away the rock to create the bench that was wide enough for their narrow gauge railroad to get up along the river. And you sort of get a feeling of that. Here's a little train on a shelf, basically. Here's one of the concrete retaining walls, and the historic picture in the upper right-hand corner. You can see that we've tried to duplicate that scene as much as we possibly could. So had you been on the mountainside on the other side of the river and photographing our train going across, it should look pretty much, minus the smoke, like the one you see in the historic pictures. And this is another look up the Doe River Gorge toward tunnel number 4. See all the trees? See all the vegetation? This is the reason a lot of folks that do narrow gauge railroads do the Colorado and the Rio Grande narrow gauge railroads, because they don't have to deal with all these trees. They're running through prairies and deserts. But this is Appalachian. We want to give you that Appalachian feel. This is a donated structure. John Waite, who's pictured on the plaque, was a math teacher in Jefferson City, Missouri, was interested in narrow gauge railroads, and he found out about East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. And on vacation times and in the summer, he started coming here and interviewing people that had worked on the railroad and collecting photographs. And he wrote a book called The Blue Ridge Stem Winder, which is the Bible, really, of the history of the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad. He built a model of it in his basement in Jefferson City, Missouri, and this is the Cranberry smelter that was in the east side of Johnson City. If you go out toward the Johnson City Country Club, you'll start seeing streets named Iron Street and Steel Street. That's where this was. They thought that Johnson City might become the Pittsburgh of the South, but in the 1800s, when Europe went bust, a lot of European investors' money dried up, and so the big furnaces never occurred here. Shell Creek, you know Shell Creek, just a little bit on the east side of the town of Rhone Mountain. We have duplicated this part of Shell Creek minus the red building. We've got Brinkley's hardware store. The next building was an Esso station. The next building that's kind of beige was the Cherokee Grill and Garrison's Garage. And a lady named Vaughn lived in the house that you see at the end. This is making the town of Shell Creek. So all of the buildings are still there except the railroad station, which is the one that's kind of right in the middle. So you mock them up to scale in cardboard to see where everything is going to fit, and then you begin to cut them out of plastic. These with an X-Acto knife. So it's some difficulty lining up doors and windows and things of that sort. And notice how short the buildings are on the left-hand side. They would be about 80 feet long, but we didn't have the space, so we left the backs wide open. You should be able to recognize all of these buildings except the green one. That's the depot, and the highway runs right where that depot was sitting. But all those buildings are still there. To make a barn that fits back in a place where you don't really have space for it, you only have a couple of inches, at Brinkley's house in Shell Creek, you see the progression starting at upper left and going through where it begins to take shape, but it's only a three-sided pie-shaped kind of structure. But once it's put in place by the house and the old cow is walking into the barn to get a little bit of rest, it looks like it belongs there. This is Church's store that you saw as a cardboard makeup, and Church's house is set right beside it. We've got pictures of that house from the 1880s. It's now yellow, it has full porches on both sides, and it looks quite different. It's lost the chimneys, but this is the way it looked in the 1880s. These are the backs of those stores. So since they were going to be cutaways, we've decorated them. And the vintage signs that you see inside are old matchbook covers from the era, advertising the various products, but they're the kinds of things you would have seen inside. The one on the left is Garrison's Garage and Cherokee Grill, and the blue behind the cutaway wall is a cafe. So we cut the wall away where you could see it. This is the back of Brinkley's store. The left side had a two-chair barber shop. We've got that. The right side was the post office, and the middle of it was mercantile. That store is still there. We got to go inside and photograph it, and you can now stand on our layout and look through the windows and watch the train go by. We then got a laser knife, which made life so much easier for me. Instead of trying to cut things out with an X-Acto knife, I now can draw the buildings to scale. We convert them to a CAD program that will run the computer on the laser knife, and we can cut out the parts. So our stage is 9 inches by 9 inches. So we have a building bigger than that, like this one, we cut it out in pieces. So here it is being cut out. It's spray painted on both sides to keep the wood from warping. So that's the gray that you're seeing. Here's what a CAD drawing looks like. This is for the Lacey store that was at Blevins. And here's the store being put together with a historic photograph behind it that we used to judge what we needed to do, down to the signage that we can see on that store. The red signs says Made in Chattanooga. It's a product called Carduli, C-A-R-D-U-I, Cardui, and it says for women. It was for menstrual cramps and other things. It was 17% alcohol. It may have been a social way of, or a non-social way of drinking, but I'm sure it helped whatever problems you might have. The others are for shoe companies that we see, post office and general store. The Lacey's thought if they had the general store and the post office and they built the depot for the railroad, their house is right behind that, a town would come around it. It never happened. The little figures there, that one photo that you saw has the Lacey family. And the little girl that's standing on the platform was 5 years old when that picture was made. Her name is Gladys Lacey. Gladys visited our museum when she was 103, 104, and 105. And when she was 105, we had this scene, and we were running trains for her. She's about 4'6". She's standing on a box looking at this, and she said, "Is that supposed to be me?" And we said, "Yeah, you're the one, right?" That's her mother, father, brother, and sister, and little Gladys is up on the loading platform. And she says, "I didn't want my picture made that day, and they told me if I was on the platform, I wouldn't be in the picture. They lied to me." From the black and white photos, we painted her brother, sister, and her coats blue. She says, "That's not right." She said, my coat was red, and so it has now been repainted. So we take photos, I draw them to scale. 1 foot equals 87 feet, it's HO scale. Pieces get cut out. Here's the photo of the Cranberry Mines as it appeared in the 1920s, which is the era that was the peak of the railroad and the era that we are modeling. You can see all the different buildings here in the part of the mountainside that's been cut away. And here's our Cranberry Mine. The water pump on the Cranberry Creek here in the foreground to supply the water for all the steam that was being generated by tons of coal that were being brought in. So the building in the far right with all the smokestacks, that's their steam generating plant. And all their tools, including the drills in the mines, were run by steam pressure. Here's another look at our Cranberry Mine. Some other scenes around the mine itself. This is a passenger shed just outside the depot where you could unload passengers if it was raining and they wouldn't get wet. This is a coal facility at the Cranberry Mine. This is the town of Rhone Mountain, and you see the picture in the inset here. That's the only photograph I've got that shows most of the town as it was in 1907. And here's our main street. Excuse me a second. The green building down in the middle is the depot. To the left of the depot, there are two buildings, one trimmed in blue and one in red. Both those buildings were still standing 2 years ago. And the one in blue has been torn down to widen the road as they put in a new bridge. And the two-story house with the green shutters, just beyond it is Wood's Drugstore, which is still there. I had a gentleman in a wheelchair a couple of years ago who grew up in Rhone Mountain. He knew where all the various people lived and who had which stores. And he said, "That's my house, the one on the hill there on the right." He said, "But dang it, I can't remember if it was red or not." Well, I don't know either, but it's dark in the photograph, and so that's what we did. This is the Rhone Mountain Inn. It's long since gone, but General Wilder, who built the Cloudland Hotel up on the top of Rhone Mountain, also built the Rhone Mountain Inn near the depot in downtown Rhone Mountain, and 5 of the buildings that were mercantile buildings. This is the largest structure we built so far on the layout. Here's the entrance to the inn. This was the Cranberry Store and post office. Post office, the little double doors on the left. The 2 stories on the right were the offices for the Cranberry Mine, and then this was the company store in between. So here's the photograph. Here's the store without people and vehicles, and here it is set up just like the photograph was. On the east side of Elizabethton was a structure called the Coal Chute. It's where the drive-in theater is if you go through Elizabethton. She was right there on the hill right beside it. And we've just completed Coal Chute. It was the last place where locomotives could get coal as they were going on east toward the Cranberry Mines, toward the town of Rhone Mountain and other places on beyond. So we've recreated that from photographs. And here are 2 different shots of Coal Chute from a slightly different angle with the coal cars up on the top. And notice that there are 3 rails here, all the way to Hampton. the railroad laid 3 rails. It was flat enough that they could push standard gauge cars, 4 feet 8.5 inches, with the narrow gauge locomotives, 3-foot rails. So you've got what are called dual gauge tracks that go that far. This is White Duck Taco and Yeehaw Brewery. This is the depot in downtown Johnson City. I'm starting to work on Elk Park right now. So you see the photograph in the background of Elk Park, and the 2 buildings on the right-hand side of the photograph are the ones that are being duplicated here, Brinkley's store and the bank. And that's now being set in place. We put the apartment house in there as of late. So you see this going on as we're building Elk Park. The top inset is the front side of the taller building you see there. And the engine house and carpenter shop that used to be in Johnson City from the photographs, and these are our models of the way it looks. And here's Hampton covered bridge. The bridge was an open truss bridge, but it began to deteriorate. It was made of wood, and they covered it like you would cover a barn. The old highway bridge is the one in the background. This was the main road from Elizabeth into Hampton and points on southeast. So here's some of what we do. We have railroad clubs, we have special tours, we have birthday parties, we have speakers for local groups. Thank you very much. We run rail excursions. We haven't run one since COVID, but we've got one that we're advertising now for the 30th of October that will take us from ETSU down to Knoxville. We'll get on the Three Rivers Rambler, ride for a while, and then get off at the boat dock, and we'll have a luncheon cruise on the Star of Knoxville. We're nationally and internationally known. That little museum. This is a book that comes out once a year for narrow gauge model railroaders called the HO N3 Annual. That's the scale of the Tweetsie Railroad that we have. The magazine is in its 25th year. In the first 24 years, we are in 7 consecutive years with 8 to 10 pages. There are now model railroad companies that are 3D printing Tweetsie railroad stock that never existed before. So we've made an impact. The last one on the bottom over there, the 2018 edition, that's our sand tunnel. We got the cover of that particular issue. And we have sent in manuscript again, so in October we should be in for the 8th consecutive year. This has national and international circulation. We're proud of.
Could you take a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Members, question?